Hey everybody, this is Scott Allen Miller here on Sam IT, and today I'm going to talk about a very high-level overview of quality of service, or QoS, for your networking. This comes up a lot specifically for those of us who work in the VoIP telephony space. People are always concerned about their quality of service because that's what potentially makes your audio sound good on your calls or your video sound good on your teleconferencing. So people, especially in this space, talk about QoS all the time. Outside of these areas, QoS still matters, but it tends to not be discussed very often, especially in the SMB, because we generally have network services that don't really need quality of service most of the time. Web, email, most of the file transfers, we don't really care that this type of file transfer is faster than that kind of website. Mostly we just care that everything has enough bandwidth. So it's only generally in specific cases where we're dealing with real-time or time-sensitive data, such as audio and video or possibly databases and storage, that we start to worry about quality of service. But it could be applied just about anywhere that we want to have something take precedence over another. So what is quality of service? At the network level, basically, quality of service simply refers to giving priorities to some types of traffic, and that could be a technical type of traffic, such as audio goes at one priority, or it could be the location. Things coming from the CEO's office or the VLAN of the accounts team get priority over everyone else. Those kinds of things. But with quality of service, we can have a tiering of priorities, and it's kind of like being on the highway and you have an ambulance. When everyone's driving down the road, if there's no one with a higher priority, everyone just drives down the road. If someone with a high priority, like an ambulance, comes by, they get to go past everyone and go down the road first. That's all quality of service really is. Now, it's important to understand that quality of service can only be applied at bottleneck points. That's basically ports on your switch or your router. You can't have quality of service on buses because there's no logic on a bus. So you can put logic for quality of service as data enters a bus, and you can have it as it exits a bus as long as there's a queue in which to hold that data to reprioritize what goes first. In a lot of cases, we don't have a queue, and there's no ability to do quality of service. But if there's not a queue, there's also no need for quality of service. This is one of the myths that kind of makes quality of service confusing. People often think that by increasing quality of service, things will go faster. But the only time the quality of service even is a conceptual thing is when we have congestion. Right, we have to have data backing up in a queue in order for there to be a moment when a processor can look at what's in the queue and decide which thing goes first. Otherwise, the data goes straight through anyway on the network, right? I hope that makes sense. If I'm sending audio packets from a PC to a server, and it has to go through a bunch of switches and routers in between, in most cases, it's going to get there and there's nothing waiting, so it doesn't wait for anything. As soon as it gets to the port on my PC, it goes directly into the wire to go to the switch. As soon as it's on the switch, it goes directly onto the bus. Once it gets to the other side of the bus, to the other port it wants to come out of, it goes straight out on that port, straight into the router, which immediately routes it to its destination. There's no waiting on an average transaction. But there are times that other things are going on. Maybe I'm watching YouTube on the same machine that I'm sending the audio from, and there's some congestion for a nanosecond while YouTube is waiting for the data to be pulled off of the bus. During that time, there could be a nanosecond delay as that audio traffic gets put into that queue. Well, we care more about that audio traffic than the YouTube in my scenario. So if there's a queue, if there's a bottleneck going on, an actual delay happening at that point, there is a sub-nanosecond moment where a process can look through that queue, determine that there's one or two packets that are more important than the others, grab them out, move them to the front of the line, and send them immediately while the other stuff continues to wait for just a split nanosecond longer. That can happen. Now, it does happen from time to time with quality of service, but in most cases, especially audio, you don't actually hear a delay until it approaches something like 200 milliseconds. Typically, your quality of service is fixing things in the couple of nanosecond range. So it doesn't tend to matter very much. You won't notice the improvement until your congestion was so bad that you're fixing things in the tens or hundreds of milliseconds range. That's not a normal network. If you were getting 200 milliseconds latency to your audio, chances are everything would be really bogged down on your network. Your web pages would load slowly, DNS lookups would take an extra long time, your YouTube videos would take forever, because that's just how networks work. So generally, if your network is working, audio is working too, because it's so tiny, it just zips right through. And when it's not working, then you probably have so many problems that you want to fix everything, not just prioritize your audio. So quality of service tends to act kind of like a Band-Aid in almost all cases, because we're prioritizing something that should basically never need prioritization. But it also acts as a protection scheme, because there are moments when you may get congestion that are just momentary and you don't want to replace your entire infrastructure. So this is where quality of service actually matters, is for spiky traffic, where sometimes you're congested but most of the times you're not, and just this one type of traffic matters enough to need to keep going quickly while other things slow down. So that there are great reasons to have quality of service, and it doesn't hurt to have quality of service all the time. It's not a negative. It just doesn't provide the positives that people often assume. But we are talking about this not to disparage using QoS, but to understand why it's used and when it comes into effect. On your LAN, quality of service tends not to matter a whole lot, but it's where it's really effective, because you control all queues in all directions as the network owner. When we go onto the WAN, this is when quality of service tends to matter a lot more, and that's because at the WAN bottleneck, we tend to take a very fast LAN, often 1 gigabit per second to 40 gigabits per second, and take many devices that are all at that speed, and aggregate them onto a single connection that today is very rarely a gigabit per second for a total size, let alone the aggregated of hundreds of gigabit connections going onto a single pipe. So this is where we tend to see things slow down, because it's a dramatic change in bandwidth, right? If you think about a lake with a tiny river coming out of it as an outlet, that's our WAN connection going into our LAN of the lake, right? The amount of water in the lake that you can move around is kind of unlimited. You never really run out of water on your lake, but when it comes to that little outlet, suddenly there's very little water moving at any given time. That's typically your WAN connection, and especially if you have WAN connections of like 1 to 3 megabits per second, which are insanely slow today but do exist pretty commonly. You may easily have quality of service issues, because everybody wants to do one single YouTube video might be more than your connection can handle. Uploading one backup file might be more than your connection can handle. So, or for a long period of time, right? It might saturate it for hours. You can't do it as fast as things can send to you or receive from you. You are the bottleneck in those cases. Generally, if you have a multiple gig connection with failover and load balancing, maybe it's not a big deal. But still, it tends to be your bottleneck point. So this is where quality of service matters the most, because it's the one spot where it's common to see queues happen that are longer than, say, 1 or 2 nanoseconds. And there's almost nothing that matters in the 1 to 2 millisecond range on your network. That's incredibly rare. It may affect you on your SAN, but we don't address SAN with quality of service. We do it by having specific high-speed dedicated hardware rather than using quality of service, because that's much more effective. Quality of service, again, only kicks in when everything slows down. So with a SAN, you simply keep everything from slowing down, whereas on your LAN and your WAN, sometimes you have to deal with it in that way. So quality of service, very important tool, very important to understand, but also very important to understand that it only kicks in at very specific points in your network, and only at very specific times when there's a queue that can sort things, and it only matters when you're mitigating a delay long enough that someone could have noticed it. So it's a lot of things have to come together for quality of service to actually benefit you in a meaningful way. That said, quality of service is relatively simple to implement. Once we understand how it works, it's pretty simple to work with, but understanding those bottleneck points is very important. A lot of people don't understand where it kicks in or how it works or how the priorities work. Because of that, they have a tendency to implement it in places that make no sense and think it's required when it doesn't do any good. And it is, with large number of things like audio calls or teleconferencing, it is quite possible for a lot of networks, if they're talking over the WAN, to commonly experience small blips of moments when quality of service would have been able to fix their issues, and it only takes a few to matter. Right. So very often we implement quality of service not because we need it all the time, but because we want the protection that it can bring for those occasional moments when we don't want to expose the fact that we may have saturated the network. Thanks for joining me. I hope that this helps you understand networking and quality of service a little bit better. We're going to dive into it a little bit more in the future. And we have talked about it a little bit in the past with VoIP specifically, but this I wanted to cover it as a more generic topic. Remember to like and subscribe, and if you want to sponsor us here at Sam IT, you can do so on Patreon.